here tonight to have a conversation about two of his new books. The first one, Another World, an Australian in Uzbekistan, which is an absolutely fascinating read. I have read it, and I've even now gone on the Silk Road train tour website. I've proposed to my husband that will be our next holiday. I was totally taken by this book. It is so captivating.
You discovered there's no such thing as the Silk Road, did you?
Well, look, it was a very, very reasonably priced $50,000 US per person.
Right.
So we might be saving that for our later years when we have more funds available. The other book we will be talking about is The Glory of Dante, which is a beautiful reflection on Dante's Divine Comedy, and really picks up some of the personalities that are dealt with in that poem as well. So what I thought I'd do is ask Richard to make some remarks, fulsome or not, you can be the judge. Then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll open up to you, our audience. So thank you, Richard.
All right, well, perhaps I'll just say a few words about Uzbekistan, which is not really on the beaten track, is it, for most Aussies? But well worth the visit. I was supposed to be going there 3 or 4 years ago, and then COVID came along, and then I was diagnosed with some form of diabetes. It's not the normal. It's related to pancreatitis. As a result, I was told, I know you paid for your fares and you're about to get on the plane, but you can't go. So I thought, well, one day I will go. So I went with my wife, and we had a month in Uzbekistan. We had a couple of days in 2 of the side stands. There are 5 stands in Central Asia, and Uzbekistan, I think, is far and away the most interesting. It's got a population of 35 million, and it's half the size of New South Wales. But it's got an amazing history. I mean, we're all fond of Australia and love it dearly, but you couldn't imagine the history of this place. It's just extraordinary. I don't know, you've all no doubt heard of Genghis Khan, who was the leader of the Mongols, and supposedly the most successful conqueror of all time. And he was succeeded by Tamerlane, as we call him in English. And that's just the start of their history. I mean, it goes back, you've heard of the Sogdians? The Sogdians had a place called Sogdia, which was there from about 6th century BC to 11th century AD. And it was essentially in today's Uzbekistan. But they were very, very significant, the Sogdians, but no one's ever heard of them these days. What's interesting about Uzbekistan today is that the average country has 1 or 2 major cities, right? We're Melbourne and Sydney. They have 4, and they're all phenomenally interesting. I mean, Tashkent is the most modern. It was wiped out almost by an earthquake in 1966, and that did them a big favour because they were then under the rule of the Soviets. And it's been completely modernised, but it's still got a history to it. It's got a very nice some churches, which are very good. And then you go to Bukhara, which was the sort of central area for the classics, the culture, the religion. Samarkand is far and away the most interesting place in one sense, although, as I said to someone a few minutes ago, Khiva is my favourite. It's the smallest one, but it's beautifully formed. It's got this minaret, which is world famous. You would have seen it, I'm sure. But again, it's well worth a visit. Samarkand it's dominated by what's called the Registan, which is a central area. It's a quadrangle, effectively, and it's got 3 former madrasas, which were the schools in those days. And Pakistan still has madrasas, but they basically churn out people who don't like us. But in those days, these were normal educational places, and the architecture is just phenomenal. I mean, even Tamerlane's burial place, which is in Samarkand, is a feature in itself. I think it's on the World Heritage List as well. So perhaps I better not keep talking, but there's so much too. We should talk about the economy. I mean, well, I'll just give you a quick history. 1991 was when the Soviet Union imploded, which meant that Uzbekistan had been under the control of the Soviet Union for about 70 years. The guy who took over was called Karimov, and Karimov was an old-style communist. And I think history will say he didn't do much for the people. They didn't improve their standard of living, unemployment was quite high. He was a funny sort of a guy in the sense that he had this notion of how to run an economy, and it really involved accumulating vast reserves. So he never got into financial trouble. He always had plenty of money to play around with. He should have reinvested it, of course, in infrastructure and everything else, but he didn't. And he was also very repressive, put everyone in jail. You couldn't open your mouth. But he died in 2016, and the guy who took over, who's still in charge as president, is Menzies. Menzies, and he has been a revelation because he'd been Prime Minister from 2003 until 2016 when Karimov died. And he's turned out to be a very enlightened autocrat. There's no such thing as democracy there, but in a sense, a bit like Singapore. Autocrats can do good things if they're good people. And this guy has done a lot of very good things. As soon as he came in, he sort of freed up the country. Child labour was a constant issue. People were forced to go out and work in the cotton fields, very young children as well, and he abolished all that. He opened up the prison, and fundamentally, my judgment is that he likes the Western model for enterprise system, but he can't say that. So they have what they call a multi-vector diplomacy, and that means keeping Russia and China and the US on side. So it's a delicate balance, and you don't want to upset them all too much, but only last week they bought $8 billion worth of planes from the US, which tells me that that's where their preference lies. So perhaps I better leave it there, but there's a lot to the story.
Did you want to say anything about your other book, Richard, before we go?
Dante?
Yeah.
Well, I thought we'd deal with Uzbekistan first, but I can if you like. Dante, I was unfortunate enough to do English literature at school, which meant we became experts on Shakespeare and Milton and various other luminaries, but of course Dante was not English, so he wasn't on the agenda. But how I came to be interested in Dante is this. I got to know Clive James before I went to London, because he wanted me to do him a favour, and he came out to Australia and signed a book for me and all that. So when we were in London, we used to go around and do book launches and things, so we had a double act. It was quite a lot of fun. So ultimately, as you know, one of the things you do as High Commissioner is you entertain people at dinners at the lodge, Stoke Lodge, which is the residence. So we had Clive and his wife along one night, and I had not done my homework, so I asked her what she did, and it turned out she was a world expert on Dante. So I was suitably humiliated, but I had said to myself, well, I must read this guy because we've never come across him before. And I did. A couple of years later, we were on holiday in Italy, so I read the 3 volumes, and I was amazed because it's such an extraordinary story. I mean, apart from the fact that he loved Florence until he died, but he was expelled from Florence under threat of being burnt alive if he ever came back. But nonetheless, he wrote it all after he'd left Florence, And if you look at his early history, his parents weren't very well off. His mother died when he was young, his father died a bit later on. So he was self-made in one sense. They weren't very wealthy. He became interested in politics, and he got to the point where at one stage he was briefly the mayor of Florence. And it wasn't until he crossed swords with the Pope. I thought his name was Boniface, but I'm told it's Bonifaci.
So they said Italian. The eighth.
Anyway, he was a very nasty piece of work because he wanted to be dominant, and he said, you know, I'm the Pope, I run everything, I'm the God's representative on earth, which means I don't have to spend any of the church money on anyone but me. And what he spent it on was acquiring new places. So he believed in the Holy Roman Empire's papal version, if you like. And he was at odds with Dante, because Dante came to the view that the Pope shouldn't control everything. And of course, the Pope wasn't going to take that for a moment, and he arranged for the city of Florence to be taken over effectively by one of his henchmen, and they arranged for Dante to be booted out. So he spent, 25 years in exile, and he wrote this amazing book. Now, maybe we'll go into it a bit later, but it's something that has gripped the public information since the early 14th century. And that's because it tells a story which is gripping. You just can't believe how vivid some of the portraits are. Now, there's poetic license, because although it's sort of meant to be him talking about the world, he's really talking about Florence, but we forgive him for that. But he names a lot of people, you see, and there are 3 popes who are in hell, for example. And he travels around. It's between Easter, Good Friday, and Easter Monday in the year 1300. So he goes to hell, accompanied by Virgil, who was a very famous Roman poet, the Aeneid, and he took him through. But unfortunately, because Virgil was born before Christ, he wasn't eligible to go to heaven. Bad luck, but there it is. So he couldn't then accompany him to heaven, and the person who accompanied him was someone called Beatrice. Now, Beatrice was not just a muse, it's extraordinary. He was betrothed at the age of about 12, but he didn't marry his wife until he was about 24. And before she died, I think, he'd seen Beatrice once, and then just fleetingly, and then he saw her again, and she didn't like him. From then on, he was infatuated with Beatrice, and he put her on the highest pedestal in heaven, and he talked about her all the time. He wrote other poems about her. It's an obsession on his part, but it's a completely pure one, because obviously she died at the age of 24, and you know, they weren't even friends, let alone partners or lovers. But nonetheless, she's a very dominant figure in his history as well. So if you read the Divine Comedy, Beatrice is quite a major player. But perhaps I'll leave it there, otherwise I'm going to talk about afterwards.
Oh no, we'll find lots of things to talk about. Look, that's given us a wonderful taster of the 2 books, Richard. Something that really struck me about your book on Uzbekistan, not least the beautiful descriptions of the 4 great cities,
yeah,
and the travel plans I'm making for my husband and I, but is the kind of, I guess, the culture of everyday people in Uzbekistan. And you were there for a month, and you observed that there were no wokesters in Uzbekistan. These were naturally conservative people. They're moderate Sunni Muslims. They are very focused on making a living, looking after their families, but they have not been affected by the wokeism that has infected us in the West, and that despite the fact that they don't live in a democracy, they have a relatively for an autocratic society, relatively free life that is absolutely focused on reform, on prosperity, the fact that the best days are ahead of them, and you contrast that in the book quite starkly with the condition we're facing in Australia, but more broadly the West, that we have a sort of sclerotic approach to economic reform, and that we, by virtue of our affluent society, have a lot of preoccupations that basically don't matter and actually against our interests. So I'd love you to reflect more on those insights you took from that month there, because I think it's a bit of a wake-up call for us that we don't necessarily need a democracy to get it right.
Yes, I mean, if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they're probably, I think there are 7 up there, and they're probably still pretty much the bottom, which is where you don't have time to worry about, reading the Guardian online, for example, and they're just struggling to earn a living, which they are now successfully doing, most of them, because unemployment's quite low. And because it's, they've been under, when you look at the history of the place and all the invasions that have occurred, they're quite sensitive to the fact that they don't want that to happen to them. So one of the good things that Menzies did when he became president, he almost straight away resumed relationships with the other stands. Karimov had said, "Don't trust any of you bastards, so I'm not talking to you again." He took the opposite view, and it's turned out to be a very smart move, because there's a lot more trade with them, and they now work closely together, which is a very good sign. So the ordinary people's lives are much better than they were under Karimov, because they're not at risk of going to jail, and unless you cross over this sort of extremist line, if you're a radical Islamist, and there are a few of them around. I mean, there were a couple of major organisations there that really threatened the place, and what they often do is they stay in the background, but they, like it's probably happening now. I mean, we just don't know who the anti-Jewish groups are in Australia. They may well be supported from outside, right? And that can happen anywhere, but because you're aware of your own history, you've learned from it. And my impression, they speak a lot of English there, a lot of modern cars, a lot of Chinese cars in Tashkent, for example. So the only drawback, I think, was the food. We call it plov. Plov. It's a sort of lamb stew, which you can have, once a week, but there I have it every day, I think. But that's a small price to pay. And they have opened up some other ethnic restaurants, which will increase, I'm sure, over time. And Tashkent's got 3 million people, so there would be a demand for diversity of food, wouldn't there? So it's got a lot of Western attributes about it, really. I watch a lot of American television, for example, and I think that, to me, they don't have any hang-ups. They just wanted to get on with life, and hopefully they will. The World Bank says they'll be one of the powerhouses of the world within 10 years. And they've had a lot of money poured in by the World Bank, but
so
it's paid off.
As a former senator and someone who's been a very active participant in our democracy, represented Australia overseas, represented our values and our interests overseas, did seeing such a successful authoritarian society give you pause for thought about the value of democracy? I mean, there's been a view that we need to spread democracies around the world, because the more democracies there are, the less likely we are to go to war. We need trade, trade ties and democratic ties, shared values, in order to sort of forestall any moves towards.
Look, I think the lesson we learned out of Iraq was that people went in there with the best of intentions. They probably hoped that they'd be able to turn it into a Western democracy. Well, you just can't force people. I mean, imagine trying to tell the Taliban to sit down and be sensible. You know, they wouldn't be in the slightest bit interested, but they're basically already locked into an ideology. And I suppose I've always been intrigued by Lee Kuan Yew's story because he was an enlightened autocrat. Eventually they ended up with a form of democracy, but what it meant was that the end result, there was one person in opposition, and then they charged him with defamation and he went to jail. So it wasn't exactly free and fair, as it should be, but nonetheless, it was this Faustian bargain that if you forego your civil rights, I'll give you economic benefits. And they bought the deal, and it's paid off enormously. I mean, they're one of the richest countries in the world now. And I don't know whether Uzbekistan can emulate that, but you couldn't ask for a better autocrat than the one they've got now.
But I mean, that's the problem with autocrats is
Yeah,
you might get a good one,
changes.
and then you get a Karamov the next time, and you know you've just got the same institutions, same set of rules, and yet
But there's
people
nothing.
have no pathway
There's
out of
nothing we can do about that. So there's no point in getting down on your knees and praying for a Democrat to turn up. He won't.
So is your view then that the Australian government spends billions in overseas development assistance? A lot of that is around supporting democracy, particularly in our region, in Papua New Guinea and around the Pacific. In the end, is your view that supporting democratic initiatives is is something that probably isn't worth the investment, and we should be supporting, say, you talk about this amazing managed liberalisation of their economy that Menzies has been engaged in. That would be a better investment in Australia's taxpayer dollars to support countries around the world.
Well, back in my early days before Parliament, I was chairman of the Australian Council for Overseas Aid, which was a peak body. So I was there for 5 years. And one of the things I learned was that the best way to deliver aid is to deliver it in a way that the recipients would like it to be. Now, we make this mistake every day of the year with the Aboriginal communities. We say to them, we're going to build housing for you. And they say, well, thanks very much. And you build the houses and they don't want to live in them. Or they set fires in the middle of the floor. So it will never work to give aid to people on the basis they have to change their view of the world or their systems. You can encourage that to happen. I mean, PNG hopefully will become a proper democracy. I don't think it is yet, but there's no point in lecturing them about it. They don't want to be told that they're the second-class citizens. What you have to do is build the institutions around them, help them, give them proper military and police force and the like. Build those things that are part and parcel of a democracy, a properly functioning executive and judiciary. So it can be done, but you could waste a lot of money giving it away.
You mentioned the Uzbekistan's foreign policy, and they are in such a unique part of the world, surrounded by the other stands, and of course at the meeting point of Russia and China, and now India, and then of course they have a lot of interest from the United States as a trade.
Not enough, actually. The US has been dragging its feet for too long. China is so proactive everywhere in the world, and they'll throw money at everyone. It's very hard to resist them. But Uzbekistan, I'm sure, is acutely aware of this. They won't say anything nasty about China because, it's one of their biggest trading partner. Russia's number 2. But if you play the game properly, you don't offend them, but you do what you want to do. I think they are doing it pretty well.
How do they manage though? When you call it multi-vector diplomacy,
Yeah.
how do they manage the conflicting tensions between, you know, the direction that Russia would like them to go in, and China, and then of course the now sort of nascent interest of the United States?
Well, they will take money from anyone, but they haven't fallen into the debt trap. You know, China's always very keen to lend you a lot of money on soft terms. You get into trouble and then they take it over, and suddenly they're running your port or your airport, right? So they're very much aware of that, and they haven't taken those things, but they belong to some of the organisations that are fronts for China or Russia, and as a result of those things, they will end up doing some trade, but it's always trying to keep the balance. And as I said, if you buy $8 billion worth of aircraft from the US, that's a pretty big commitment. But 2 weeks before that, they were attending a big Xi Jinping gathering, and there were stories that, you know, China's really got the whip hand here. Well, I don't think they have, but I think America should be doing more than it has been to date. And Trump has said positive things. I don't know that he's promised to go there. No president ever has, but he should. You know, it's on the way to somewhere. It's what Kissinger once said about Australia.
In terms of foreign policy, do you think there's a lesson for Australia? I mean, they have to navigate such a complicated geopolitical environment. I mean, we couldn't even imagine it. We at least have the Indian and the Pacific Ocean and southern.
Well, Albanese's trying to do this, and so is Starmer. What they're doing is they're trying not to offend China. They won't criticise, but they did it with Linda Thorpe yesterday, right? Linda Thorpe said she's going to burn down the Parliament House. Everyone else came out and screamed and yelled and asked for apology. Wong, and Albanese said nothing.
Yeah.
And that's because their strategy is to try and keep people on side. So they will want her vote at some stage. So if they tell her she's a bloody idiot, she may not vote with them, right? So this is how you operate, and you do the same with China. Now, it's dangerous because ultimately the Chinese think they can keep getting away with things. So if they want to encircle Australia and, you know, take photos and everything else, you don't say boo. Well, naturally enough, they'll think they can get away with it again. And I just think it's a very dangerous game, that. I mean, what they think is that they can not say anything to offend, but they can still do things that are positive and not necessarily in Japan's favour, in China's favour. So when they did that treaty with PNG, which I think is a great achievement all around, I don't know that Alba had much to do with it, but anyway, the Chinese subsequently came out and criticised Australia for doing it. So they knew what was going on, but it looked as though, because I said they'd go and have to get approval from China before they signed up, it looked as though China had the whip hand, but ultimately they didn't. So Albo says to himself, well, as long as I can keep doing things that are not necessarily in China's favour, but never criticise China, we'll muddle through. But it's a political strategy. It's got nothing to do with national interest, and I don't think it's healthy ultimately.
It sounds like Mirziyoyev has been pretty cautious about commenting on Russia and China. I mean, he obviously wants to keep everyone sweet.
Yes.
I mean, they have the huge environmental catastrophe of the Aral Sea, where I think 80% of the Aral Sea is
90.
90. There you go. So it drained.
It was the fourth largest lake in the world, which means it's inland water, and it's all the fault of the Russians, because back in the Soviet Union days, they had the idea that cotton should be grown in the best possible place, which was Uzbekistan, but all of that cotton should be sent to Russia for processing. And I think it might have become Uzbekistan's largest export, but it's probably still right up there now. I mean, gold is probably the biggest, but cotton. And what the Russians did was there are two major rivers, and they're both going in the same direction towards the Aral Sea, and they're both south and north of the country, effectively. and they diverted those rivers into cotton channels, so, you know, to feed the crops. But as a result, the water's petered out, the Aral Sea, as Georgina said, has shrunk to, you know, absolutely nothing. It was a very big tourist resort. A lot of Russians used to go there. Russia is still quite a popularly used language, which is interesting because you might think that that meant that they were favourites, but it's just an inherited thing because the Soviets were there for 70 years. So they're not at all keen on Russia, and they have said some critical things. So is Kazakhstan. Everyone's awake to what's going on, and Russia is very much out of favour, particularly after what they've done in Ukraine. You know, the president of Kazakhstan has been very critical of that, and he adjoins Russia. So he's got a lot to lose in one sense, but he's been quite courageous, and Uzbekistan's pretty much gone along with that as well. So where it's sufficiently serious, they will speak out, but it's just another, you know, episode. Perhaps they don't.
I thought we might go on to Dante now, the glory of Dante, your book that you wrote in 2024, and then the following year you wrote Another World, Australia and Uzbekistan. Is there any connection we can draw between the two? I know the publisher said that both were about, there's no wokeness in Dante and there's no wokeness in Uzbekistan, and we can draw that very thin bow. But you know, Dante writes about the human condition, and there's a strong emphasis on personal responsibility, which is really out of favour. I mean, I run the Robert Menzies Institute, and we deal every day in Menzies values, and he was very strong on individual responsibility. That you should be in charge of your own education, of your own. A lot in life, you were given gifts that you didn't have any control over, your mind, your physical attributes, but your ability to make the best of them, that was up to you. And then these days there is I need help, there's a sort of increasing sense of frailty of the human condition, and we'll just look to government to fix it. It's much easier that government fixes it than me, the individual. It shouldn't fall on me, too much of a mental burden.
Yeah, and I think all that's very valid. I mean, Florence was nothing like a democracy, and Florence played the politics of the what do you call it, the emperor? What was the emperor called?
The Holy Roman Emperor.
Holy Roman Emperor, yeah. So they played.
Who was there doing Dante? I can't remember.
No, I can't remember either. I don't think it was terribly significant.
No, Pope.
No?
You got city-states.
Yes.
Which
Florence was probably the richest of them all. I mean, it was a very successful place, despite the fact that it didn't have democracy. I mean, just to go back to your point, I think it's just hard to compare. It's like comparing, a cricketer from the 19th century to a cricketer now. Well, everything's changed. The bats are bigger and stronger, and the pitches are quite different. So the same goes for Dante's. But your point about relying on the individual is very valid, because his whole thesis through the Divine Comedy is it's up to you. And the people who are in hell are there because of bad things they did during their lifetimes. If you avoid those things and do the right thing, you'll get there. Now, that was much more common as a view in those days, I think, because they didn't have welfare systems, so people couldn't put their hands out to government. And we've sort of gradually declined in terms of personal responsibility, but Dante, that's why Dante is quite refreshing, because he's essentially telling you what you do know. I mean, you get on in life because of the things you do. You don't get to be a senator because someone says, wouldn't you like to be a senator? And sign up here. You get there because you bloody well fight for it, right? And in the same sort of way, whatever profession you follow or trade, you get there as a result of your own efforts. And
What do you think Machiavelli's attitude
We'll
today?
do questions at the end. Thank you.
yeah, well,
Yes, later.
I don't know how you
Have you
classify
got
him.
Yes, later.
He was the dark arts of politics. I don't think he was particularly interested in saving his own soul. Yeah.
I mean, Dante places the corrupt popes, politicians, and some personal enemies in Inferno. It's sort of a moral audit
Well,
of his age.
Yeah.
Do you think there's something that we can draw from that today? I mean, I know at the end of your essay you sort of go through all the evils, and then you
I go
do
through
draw
what
out.
was sins in those days
Yeah, and you
that
draw-
aren't sins now.
That's right, and I think that's very interesting that
Yeah.
there was that moral audit of the
Yeah.
of the 14th century, and then in the 21st century, so many of those things are excused, and that's
Yeah.
the nature of society changing. It's
Yeah.
14th century Italy, we're 21st century Australia. Of course, we're different, but some of those things you would have thought perhaps were eternal, and yet they're not.
Well, of course, the Catholic Church dominated everything in Dante's time. So there was no real opposition, no alternative religions, and there was a proper way of life, basically, and it did rely very much on you looking after yourself, because there wasn't the welfare for anyone else to do it for you. Nowadays, we have so many options, it's unbelievable. You could probably get through life without having a job, really. That's why it's very hard to compare, but the key to Dante is, how do you live your own life? And if you want to do good things, you'll get rewarded.
Clive James, who you've spoken about earlier, and he writes his translation of Dante, of the Divine Comedy, which must have been an interesting exercise when your wife is a world expert in this, to then take that on and later, quite later in life too. It was one of his final projects, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, he was on his deathbed for about 8 years.
He was always about to die, wasn't he? It was a long,
So I think I said this earlier, but I think it's a crucial point. When I read the translation I did, I forget who it was now, it was Montague or something, they had very extensive footnotes. So they gave you a picture portrait of the Pope and everything else, and you then understood what Dante was talking about. But if he just mentioned names and then you move on, you're lost.
Well,
and that's the problem with Clive. Clive didn't use footnotes. What Clive did was turn 3 lines into 4 quatrains. Now, that's all very clever, but that's typical of Clive. He was a great performer, as we all know, and he was a very amazing guy, actually, because he could have had a very comfortable life just being a television compere, but he didn't. His first love was poetry, and he went back and did a lot of that, and then he wrote books along the way. So, I think you'd have to say he made a great contribution to our lives.
He said of Dante that contained more of life than any other writer.
Yeah.
I mean, was Clive James so captivated by Dante because he faced his impending death, obviously for 8 years, or was it the influence of his wife?
No, the best tribute is from T.S. Eliot. He said, Shakespeare and Dante dominate the world between them. There is no third. So, right from the 1300s onward, he died in 1325, was it? He became a
56.
superstar very soon after his death.
And all these writers died at 56.
What?
Well, Dante died at 56. You look at some of the others.
No, he
famous
died in
writers.
the
Shakespeare,
25.
how old was he?
Oh, age, yeah, no, that's true. I always think of someone who died at 35, Mozart.
But he wasn't a writer.
No, but he did bloody long his time, didn't he? So, as I say, he was always recognised as a superstar, but immediately after his death, it became even more popular, and there was a short phase during the Renaissance when people sort of didn't like his values and he fell out of favour a bit, but fundamentally, I don't think in Australia he gets the recognition he should. I mean, if you drive around Italy, there's plaques or statues. There's Dantes everywhere, right? They know how important he is to their culture. And it's more than that, I think. It's someone that they revere because, you know, we're all frail. As William Wilde, who's a very famous film director, said, nobody's perfect, and what he meant was he'd been divorced 5 times. But the point is, you know, we can't all be saints, right? But you look at the life that Dante lived and the odds that were against him. You know, he never saw his wife again, basically, 25 years.
I mean,
and he never took up with anyone else, so you can never criticise his morals.
No. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Richard, Dante's the first writer who writes in what becomes known as Italian.
The vernacular.
Not
Standard
in,
Italian.
in Latin.
Well, it was more the Florence language than anything else.
So he, I mean, he really represents for Italians, you know, part of their civilization, their culture, a real stepstone. So you can understand their obsession with him. But
Well, you could say this is Florence, that, you know, we're from Verona.
I'm going to ask you a question. Though. So,
Died in Ravenna.
what I'd like you
Wonderful
to reflect on, Richard,
Yeah.
is where Dante fits into the Western canon and Western civilization. Because, as you say, in Australia there is a ambivalence to Dante, an ignorance of Dante even. We have some lovers here or admirers of Dante, which is fantastic.
Well,
but I
there
wouldn't
are
say
a
that's
few Dante societies, but
I wouldn't say that's a mainstream preoccupation in Australia.
As I say, we never heard of him at school.
Why? So, I mean, you would obviously, you've written a book about the glory of Dante. You obviously are interested in attracting much more attention to him and his works and his impact and his importance. But I mean, what can we say about the health of Western civilization here in Australia if it's so adherent to figures like Dante?
Well, you'll never find a society where everyone's a sort of a quasi-intellectual. I mean, you'd hardly put Trump in that category. He's at the top of the tree. So it's a bit unrealistic to expect that everyone's going to be knowing about Dante. But if you look at Italy, I would have thought even, you know, the lowest level of people haven't heard of him and know of him and admire him, whereas here we don't, and he's not ours. I mean, I'll get down on my hands and knees to admire Bradman, for example, because, you know, he was so much better than anyone else. His average was twice what most other people's average was. And that was in a day before television, and he was a serious rock star. So I don't think you can expect that suddenly we'll all be Dante favourites, but I think people who want to think seriously about their life and you know, what lessons you can learn from the great books can't do any better than reading Dante. And I mean, it's very vivid the way he writes this book. If you're in hell, you know, it's all dark. They've often got their heads turned around the wrong way. It's very, very painful, and you know you're there forevermore. So that's pretty frightening stuff. You go to the Imperium in heaven, it's not quite as exciting in a way because it's perfect, but it's again to be sought after, and I think that's what he does do. He tells you that life is worth living. It's worth living according to moral standards, and there is a reward. It's not in this life; it's in the next life, and that's pretty important, really.
Yeah. Well, we have a very enthusiastic audience, Richard, who are dying
Yeah.
to ask you questions.
Yeah.
So I will stop here and open the floor. But for my part, thank you very much. It's fascinating. I'm so pleased I got this opportunity to have this in conversation with you about two really, really interesting topics of two very, very, very worthy books, which I commend to you all. Another World in Australia in Uzbekistan is available for purchase tonight.